Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to our Wednesday night webinar. You're with us here at the NoCD Forum World Created, blah, whatever we want to, what should we call it tonight, April? I don't know. Maybe something fun and exciting, or just NoCD is always fun and exciting as well, too.
Diversity webinar. It's simple.
And it's our Wednesday night. Here we are. April, you want to introduce yourself? I gotta send little background Kaylee text messages here. Hi, background Kaylee. Okay. She's in our background, always doing things. So.
Hi, I'm April. I am new to NoCD, maybe about 6 weeks in, but have been treating OCD and anxiety for a little over 10 years, mostly in the intensive PHP IOP setting, but also in some private practice. And I also specialize in the intersection of OCD and anxiety with autism spectrum. So that's fun sometimes. Very fun, actually.
Oh, Rose is here. Rose, come on in.
Hi,
Rosie. How are you? Good.
Good
to see
you.
All right. Very good. April, just out of curiosity.
Yes.
April, before we get to Rosie. Thank you. Rosie, we'll get there in a second. Who was the awesome person that introduced you to the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder, if I may ask?
I believe that would be you, Dr.
Oh, it was, wasn't it? Yes.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Oh.
You told all of us interns that this was the only thing we'd want to treat and the way we would want to practice, and you were right.
Yeah. I tell every student of mine, most who say to me, "Oh, come on, that's not going to happen." And at about maybe a month or two in, they say, "You might have been right about that this might just be the thing that I do from now on." So,
you know what? I told my intern that last year, and now he's all about OCD and ERP.
Well, there we go. That's wonderful. Rosie, hello. You want to introduce yourself, Rosie, and say hi to all the folks out there in the lovely world of the NoCD webinar?
Sure. Hi, I'm Rosie Stimmel, and I'm an OCD therapist. Right? Like I think everyone who's going to be watching this is. What do you want me to say?
Well, tonight is going to be a couple of things. We have probably some therapists watching. We also have people with OCD watching. And tonight is our Wednesday night Diversity Matters webinar. And tonight we're focusing on Jewish culture. So you guys, ladies, may see over, I don't know if it's on that side or that side, whichever way you're looking, but it's on that side for you. Okay. There is a running chat, and I will monitor the chat and throw out some questions. We will get a mix of questions tonight. We might get some culture questions. We may also get some general OCD questions as well, too, which are fine because then we can all kind of chat and discuss those too. But first, I always like to kind of start off with a little bit of the cultural piece and talk about Judaism. Now, Jewish, of course, and by the way, to both of you, I play just kind of the dumb guy who asks the questions that maybe no one else asks or is afraid to ask, and so that's my role tonight, is to play the guy to ask the questions. What is being Jewish, right? I mean, there's a religious aspect, there's a cultural aspect. Rosie, how would you define that, or how do you separate out those two things? For some, are they all one? For others, are they different? What would you say?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a good question. So I personally, I'm part of the Orthodox Jewish community. I observe Judaism in the traditional, what we call Orthodox style. Although, as I'm sure you know and others know, there are many variations in different communities, either within Orthodoxy and also outside of Orthodoxy within the rest of Judaism. So there are all different, levels of observances, types of observances, according to what people feel resonates with them, what makes sense to them. So, according to my understanding, which is going to be different for different people depending on where they come from. But so there's kind of two aspects, I guess, of what you're asking, right? Where there's this idea of kind of, being born Jewish, right? That according to the Orthodox tradition, a person understands that a person born with a Jewish mother is Jewish. And that's kind of something that you can't shed according to the Jewish understanding, even if you choose not to observe. And then there's also a way to become Jewish through going through a conversion process, if you start out as not being Jewish. But that's just the kind of the label, I guess, the identity, right? The according to Jewish law, which we call halacha, right? The halachic definition. And then there's everything else, right? So there's the spirit of everything. There's the observance. There's the rules that we follow, and then there's all of the values that we try to live by. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah,
It's a broad question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. April, you've worked in areas where there's a high Jewish population and worked specifically with OCD in the Jewish community. So what kind of observations have you seen or presentations have you seen that might be unique among the Jewish community versus some other communities? Our diversity webinars so far have looked at African Americans, Latino, Asian, autism, gay, lesbian, all sorts of areas. Yeah. So, monthly, we just like to pick a topic to take a look at how specifically does this maybe area, this culture, this division, whatever it is that we would be focusing on, interact with OCD. So what have you seen?
Well, so I've seen a range. I've worked with people who I guess are just kind of like plain Jewish, is the way to say it. And by no means do I mean to be offensive. I do not have a strong religious background, so I'll probably put my foot in my mouth a few times. Just regular Jewish. I've seen that show up with OCD, and typically that doesn't cause much of an issue. Where I've run into it, and run into like some hard walls as to how do I practice with this is with the Orthodox Jewish faith. And I had to do some research and kind of very quickly get myself up to speed with a client that I see in private practice that I started at a PHP IOP setting who came in very severe, and quickly kind of tried to explain to me some of the rules and the followings and the practices that she was engaging with. There was a whole issue around the length of her skirt and the appropriate length and what happens when she sits down, when she stands up, when she goes upstairs. How can she be sure that her skirt length is always where it needs to be? And then we spent a whole lot of time talking about and developing exposures around the mikveh, which I will maybe leave to you, Rosie, to explain rather than me butcher it. There's, needless to say, a lot of opportunity for checking compulsions to come up, for decontaminating compulsions to come up with the mikveh. And one of the things I think I saw that really had surprised me and left me kind of struggling to figure out how to approach this was I found a document that was the 13 Principles of Judaism Faith. And the principles all start out, I believe, with perfect faith. Which I was like, well, no wonder there's OCD here. If you ask anybody to believe perfect faith in anything. And I'm someone who, when I work with perfectionists, I will tell them right off the bat, there is no such thing as perfect in reality. We're going to take perfect off the table. Yeah. So they then have this document that's a basis of religious or cultural, spiritual practice that says, no, you're going to believe with perfect faith. What I felt like I had to kind of dance around a little bit. How do we talk about how that's not really possible without me dismissing or devaluing your practice?
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting line. Yeah, for sure.
I would love to jump in a little if I
please, Rosie. Yeah.
Possible. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, April. And I just want to validate for a minute your experience because I've worked with the Orthodox population. In addition to being Orthodox, I've worked clinically with the Orthodox population for over 5 years. Some with OCD, many with other, mental health challenges. But this can be extremely challenging to navigate, even as someone from within the community. So I can only imagine how challenging it could be for someone who's not within the community. So I just want to validate that for a moment. One important thing I keep in mind with any kind of Jewish source that you're going to come up is that everything has been translated from Hebrew. And so the English translation is never going to be exactly capturing the essence of the original, right? Mm-hmm. So when you talk about, what you're talking about there with that source, the Hebrew word for perfection, is shlimus, right? Or, perfect is shalima, which doesn't exactly 100% translate to perfect. In some contexts, it means whole or complete, right? Depending on the context, it can mean slightly different things. And more than the word, it's kind of like a concept, right? However, and I think, so this is so important, I'm sure, when you're treating any kind of, anyone with OCD from any cultural group that is not your immediate cultural group. And it's also when I'm working with members of the Orthodox population, unless they're from exactly my community, where we follow all the exact norms, I also need to do this. That's very important to check with someone, with your client's permission, of course, but to check with someone from within the community about what's normative and what's not. And this will vary community to community, and it's very challenging. We can't, and I can't go and find a source and say, this guides what you should or shouldn't be doing, because it's going to be so dependent on the particular community that they're in, and even the particular rabbi that they might follow. And so it's going to be very important to get that guidance. But so being able to differentiate like what is normative and what it's not, I think it can be great to bring in sources. I actually have a number of sources that I got from a supervisor of mine that I'd be happy to send to you afterwards, which can be great.
I love that PowerPoint you sent me was wonderful. Actually, there's some great stuff.
But it's interesting to note that she actually says she does a presentation, and there's a recording available also that I'd be happy to share. But she actually says that she specifically usually won't share those sources with the clients, because she knows that more likely than not, they're going to either disagree or find a way to disagree or bring a different source that contradicts it, that she uses them more as guidance for herself, for other therapists, potentially for family members and community members, and only maybe in certain situations where she thinks it'd be well received, she would bring it in. So I think, so much of it is community dependent. I think going back to what you said, with everything in mental health, right, there's this stress diathesis model, right, of like the environment and the stressors. And I think that for a person observing, religious Judaism, there's ample ground to find the stressors. Judaism is a religion that's not just based on faith and ideas and values, but it's also based very specifically on a set of specific rules that do include quite detailed guidelines for how to do various different religious things. And so following those guidelines to the T in many communities is normative, is not OCD, right? So we have to think, how do we differentiate and how do we distinguish, which is a big question, which I know, Dr. McGrath, you were going to bring up later. But I guess if I could pipe in about that for a minute, I think like with everything else, how do we distinguish it is what is the feeling when they're doing it? What is the goal? Are they doing it compulsively because they feel that they have to alleviate their distress, and it's a burden and it's frustrating and it's terrible for them, right? Or are they doing it because that's what they want to be doing? That's egocentric. That's what they believe in, right? That ascribes to their values. And is it taking them further towards their maybe goal of, let's say, being more religiously connected, or further away, right? And usually with OCD, it's actually taking them away from that.
Which we see in scrupulosity, no matter what the presentation. I can think of even Muslim individuals I've worked with who, as they're doing the ritual washing before going into the mosque, did they rinse enough, right? Did they wash their feet well enough or anything like that?
Right.
Working with Jewish families who had thrown out 3 sets of dishes in a month because maybe dairy and meat crossed with each other and they shouldn't, and that's a no-no, right? So
Right.
The thing that I love about doing these Wednesday night diversity webinars monthly is that though different cultures may have various presentations of OCD, that underlying it's still OCD, no matter what the culture is. There's the doubt, right? There's the issues with perfectionism. There's and the way we interpret. Like Rosie, I loved what you were describing about translation, and that made me think about OCD's translation is always, what's the worst case scenario that I could possibly violate, and that's going to be the one that I'm going to focus on, right? So yes, it could be translated as whole or something else, but that doesn't matter because it could be translated as perfection, and that's the one that I really need to focus on too. And so that literalness that really comes in for people can be very difficult, right?
Yeah. I think, 2 other things I think that I was thinking about, April, when we were talking, right? That, the mainstream, all of Judaism really makes, this is going to sound, redundant, but makes space for us to be human beings, right? That there's no expectation of being able to do something that's beyond human, being able to do something that's completely perfect, or, with absolute certainty or with no risk, right? And so that's something that I think can resonate with a lot of clients, right? That these rules, religious rules, are handed down to human beings, not to robots or angels or someone else who could do it in some perfect way. And there are allowances for us to be human, right? So that's one thing. And again, potentially enlisting an advisor, a rabbi, a mentor to echo that concept for the person, I think, can be helpful. And then also, I think when you were talking about, you're struggling with sort of hedging around these, tenets of faith or whatever, right? I think that, one thing that my supervisor talks about in her talk is kind of framing this as not, I'm here to be against your religion, to make you less religious, but it's you and me together against the OCD, right? Mm-hmm. And that could actually be you and me together to then enhance your life and your values, which one of them is your religious identity, right? To actually enhance your religious identity in a way that's meaningful by decreasing the stuff that's taking you away from your ability to observe in the way you want to, right? And maybe asking them questions about, is this the type of person you want to be, the type of Jew you want to be, the way you want to be observing, the way you want to be acting with family, with friends, all of that. Is this taking you away from things that you actually feel are very important because you're stuck, let's say, checking and rechecking your dishes for hours, and maybe there are other things that you actually want to be doing, right? Even religiously, or let's say with prayer, right? Are you praying because you feel connected, or are you praying because you feel that you just have to? And if you don't pray, you're going to be so anxious, right? And is that the prayer?
Welcome to scrupulosity there. Yeah, yes. Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting comment we just got from I'll bring it up here. And Rosie, maybe if you, here's the various community and the idea of, how about in Orthodox communities? And I think that, again, this applies to so many various types of communities, not just Judaism, but, older generations, younger generations, those types of things. The concept of mental illness, we talked about this in our last diversity webinar when we were doing Hispanic and Latin American, with the idea that, that's kind of hush hush and we don't talk about mental health issues. So how is that different in this culture? And is there anything you would add to that? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think this can be challenging in a lot of traditional cultures. I think that we really are seeing greatly increased mental health awareness in all religious Jewish communities across the board, even the most ultra-Orthodox, the Hasidic Jewish communities, all of those, that we're definitely seeing much increased awareness and acceptance of this. I think, Hadassah, your comment about kind of wrapping it up with going off the derech, which, in English means, kind of shedding religious observance, not being religious anymore. I hear that comment, and it's very challenging. And I think that there are actually, a number of great sources that do speak about mental health, even from, very, very old ancient sources that speak about the importance to be aware of mental health, and even where to draw the line between mental health issues and real religiosity. I want you to have hope that, I do see increased awareness in a lot of communities. And, I don't know if I can say this or not, but you can feel free to, reach out in some way if you want to discuss this further through NoCD or through some other way. And I'd love to get you hooked up with, resources that are culturally sensitive that can help you or whoever you're thinking of.
I remember this came up actually for the client that I was working with. In part in two ways. One, because I had asked to speak to her rabbi to understand the norms of their community. And she was very cautious about me having any interaction with people in the community because of the stigma around mental health. And I thought it was also additionally interesting, like it wasn't even just about the stigma that could come to her. It was the stigma that could come to the whole family, because she had a younger brother that was still in the matchmaking process for getting married. And so didn't want anything like that out there that might color another family's perspective of him as a potential son-in-law and husband for a daughter. And occasionally, like glimpses of talking about mental illness would show up in a newsletter that she would get or in some kind of magazine. And she would just be so excited that like, wait, someone's actually starting to talk about it. Like, and it's hard enough to have OCD and try to deal with it and manage it, I think to have to do that and have to kind of do it in secret and not really be able to feel like you have the support of your community is just an extra burden to have to carry on.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, on all the Jewish magazines now, right? There's always weekly columns on mental health and, columns written by therapists and psychiatrists and everyone. It's really becoming much, much more out there. But there also are a lot of clinics and groups in various communities that are composed mainly of Orthodox clinical staff who have that, cultural sensitivity and cultural competence. And I think those can be great resources, just in getting connections and getting resources for the community. I think that in a case like this where she was so afraid of the stigma, I would see if there's anybody who may, whether it's her rabbi or not, but maybe a family member or a friend or someone who she's disclosed her struggles to, who already knows about what she's going through. And then if she'll give permission, that can kind of be your in, to getting connected with, understanding the norms and understanding a little bit more about what's going on in the community.
Yeah. Once again, as a reminder to everyone, you're listening to the NoCD webinar. NoCD, a downloadable app that you can get on Google Play and iOS. Through the NoCD app, you can get a therapist that will do teletherapy with you. These two wonderful ladies with me tonight are two of our teletherapists from across the country, and we're getting to all 50 states here, so that's really, really exciting. And we continue to make more and more relationships with insurance companies so that we can get more and more people covered to be able to utilize their insurance so that their treatment is affordable and it is evidence-based, because we use exposure and response prevention therapy as our format for treatment. So please feel free to go to treatmyocd.com or nocd.com or download the app, and you can hit the therapist button on there if you're looking for therapy for obsessive compulsive disorder. Tonight's our Wednesday night webinar, as we always do, and the third Wednesday of every month is our Diversity Matters series. We started this after the incident that occurred with George Floyd, where we decided that it was time for us to take more of a stand around diversity concerns and issues, because many times things happen in our country and our society and people rally around it for a month or two and then let things kind of go. And we decided that we wanted to dedicate the third Wednesday of every month to a diversity topic so that we could take a look at how does diversity concerns or issues interact with obsessive compulsive disorder as well too. So if there are topics that people have ideas on that they would like to see about that, please feel free to reach out to us, and we would be happy to program that on an upcoming Wednesday night webinar and or a Diversity Matters webinar in the future. And we also at times have other guests as well too. So I know coming up soon, we're going to have Stuart Ralph. If anybody listens to the OCD stories, he's interviewed me 4 times for the OCD stories. I get to turn the tables and I will be interviewing Stuart Ralph. So this will be exciting. I'm looking forward to that. They'll be coming up in a couple of weeks. All right, Rosie and April, I'm going to throw some questions to us as well too, that are coming in off the stream, because we also like to take some of those and get some of your take on it too, because I want people to see both of you as good clinicians as well too, and some of the work that you're doing. So here's one from Mason. I keep falling back into OCD after making progress with ERP. I do have a fear of OCD and the distressing feelings that come with it. Any advice? Maybe I'm not doing ERP at the root. What are your thoughts on that?
So I often talk to people about OCD, and I use the metaphor of the whack-a-mole game, which hopefully I'm not just super dating myself, but so far, even like the 21-year-olds know what whack-a-mole is. So I think that's good. Where each mole kind of represents a different content area of OCD, like a different obsession that pops up, and we get really caught up trying to like whack each individual content obsession. And it's one of OCD's tricks to like keep you occupied and keep you distracted from looking inside the box at what is actually driving OCD. And the thing, if you can like imagine zooming out of all the little moles and looking at what's inside the machine driving them, is a refusal to have discomfort or uncertainty in your life. And that really, it doesn't matter what each mole is. It doesn't matter if it's something you've had before, or if it's something that's going to show up in 5 years. It's all about a refusal to have uncertainty and discomfort in your life. And so the more you can kind of think about doing ERP as, how can I lean into uncertainty and discomfort instead of trying to run away with it? I think that can be helpful, because it might, OCD, of course, is going to try to be sneaky. And as you work on one area and knock something down and do less compulsions, it's going to try to throw another mole at you, right? And say, okay, you worked on this one, but what about this? Right. So rather than getting too caught up in the content of what your obsessions and compulsions are, trying to see it as just this generic issue of uncertainty and discomfort and leaning into it that way, which isn't to say you've been doing ERP wrong, but just it's like a more meta way of looking at doing at OCD treatment.
Yeah. Rosie, taking that a step further, then, how would you see that? Or let me change. What would you say would be some of the more common themes of discomfort or uncertainty in the presentation of OCD, maybe in an Orthodox or conservative Jewish community?
Yeah, I mean, well, it can really have any presentation, just like it can in any OCD.
Of course, yeah.
I think that, I think that often there's kind of a core fear behind it, of course, of doing something, religiously wrong. And there's something behind that. There are in the religious sources ideas about consequences for doing things wrong, the idea about the effect of it on the soul and all of these things, and kind of eternal, long-lasting effects. And taken alone, these kind of ideas can become, could feel overwhelming, could feel scary, right? And so then it can manifest really in any way, being, for example, like April's client, that was struggling with doubt over how long her skirt was, right? So this is something that the majority of people don't struggle with in that context. They wear a skirt of whatever they deem to be the appropriate length. Depending on their community, they try to make sure it covers even when they're sitting down, right? But that's kind of the end of it. They understand people make mistakes. If you happen to move and your knee shows, okay, you made a mistake, right? It's not the end of the world. Mm-hmm. But your client honed in on this, right? And just like with all OCD, we see honing in on something in particular, while actually being able to tolerate the uncertainty in all these other areas that we're not paying attention to, right? So I personally, I've seen it in relation to keeping kosher. For example, there are protocols for checking certain vegetables to make sure there are no bugs. For example, it's prohibited to eat bugs. And so this is something that can very easily lend itself to OCD, because the bugs are very small. They're very hard to see. They're very hard to distinguish from dirt. And so it's very easy to go down that rabbit hole. But of course there is a system set up, like I said before, to allow for being human, right? That we do our best up to a certain limit that's normal, and then we stop. Same with Passover, the Passover holiday, where we eliminate any breadcrumbs or other types of what we call chametz. It's a complicated definition for what exactly it is, but this also is something that can lend itself easily to having trouble understanding where the line can be drawn. So these are kind of like common areas. Also mikvah, as you mentioned, April, which is, in a nutshell, a process that a married woman, goes through after having her menstrual cycle, a purification process, where she first cleans her body in various ways and then immerses in a ritual body of water, which is called a mikvah. And so this is also something that, can easily lend itself to uncertainty, to doubt, not being sure whether or not you checked everything appropriately. But then there are other things also, with men, it can come up more often in regards to the way that they're saying or pronouncing words of prayer. There are certain prayers that are required to be said and pronounced and said in a certain way with no interruptions, in a certain order. But again, we're human beings, right? Remembering whether or not they said the right prayer at the right time. And the Jewish law makes allowances for that also, right? That there are certain rules about if it's within 30 days of a change in what you say, then you do repeat it or you don't repeat it, because that's the norm. It's the norm to make a mistake, right? When you're getting used to something new. For example, there's certain prayers we say at different times of year, right? For men, also, it can have to do with their tefillin, what they wear, the religious thing that they wear on their head in the morning when they pray, and it has to be in a certain spot, right? So, but then it can manifest in any way, worries about having thoughts or worries about even what if I do something in the future, right? Kind of like those, what might manifest in other ways of what if I lose control, right? What if I lose control? And some people might have a thought, what if I lose control and, hurt someone or hurt myself? And this in this area might be, what if I lose control and I break my religious rules? So it can really come up in a lot of different ways. But it's that general, I guess, that challenge, that inability to tolerate. Actually, my supervisor put it very well, that she talked about that when we push them to do exposures, we're never pushing somebody to break Jewish law, right? We're pushing them to accept the possibility that something could go wrong, right? To accept the risk, to accept the increased risk of coming to transgress. We're not pushing them to actually transgress. And that's obviously an important distinction. Yeah. But I guess it's that inability to tolerate even the idea, the possibility, right, of I might sin or I might do something wrong, which of course is always a possibility when we are human beings, which we are.
Of course. I like this question. The average person always says, follow your gut. How can someone with OCD handle gut feelings? Because they're always alarm bells. That's a great question.
Yeah. It's a great question. It's a very challenging question. I think a lot of the science kind of says that in a lot of ways that gut system is not working as it should in OCD, right? That normal feedback that tells you when you're done something or you've completed something is not there. And I think that actually we can rewire that a little bit through ERP, right? Through the discomfort that comes through doing ERP, but then the learning process that comes as we do something and we learn that we're okay and we're safe and we did whatever we did. And then we can kind of rewire that area of learning, what's okay and what's not okay. When am I done something? When am I not done something? But I think that this is a challenging thing. Yeah, I don't know. April, any thoughts on that? Distinguishing your gut from your anxiety?
Yeah, I too have seen the research that says, if you have an anxiety disorder or OCD, that your gut is probably wrong. So I think that you can still use your gut feeling, but instead of following it, probably what you're going to want to do is do the opposite of it, right? Because it's probably telling you to avoid, to get reassurance, to do a compulsion, distract, right? All the stuff that we know that anxiety and OCD want you to do in the short term, that give you relief in the short term, but over the long term actually just serve to build and grow the OCD and anxiety. So check in with that gut feeling and recognize, is it telling me to do these like short-term shortcuts? And if so, how can I do the opposite? Is it telling me to get away from the thing I'm afraid of? That means I probably need to go toward it. I probably need to do an exposure of some sort that takes me closer to it, not away from it.
Right. Yeah. I think also sometimes it'd be helpful to bring in the idea of values, right? Mm-hmm. That I like to ask people, does doing this fit with the values that you want to live your life by, whether religious or not religious, right? That people have generally an idea of what's important to them and what's meaningful. And that, to question that gut sense in that way, right? Okay, your gut is telling you to do this, but is this what you really believe is important for you to be spending your time on, right? And usually with OCD, the answer is going to be no.
Yeah, and I feel like I've seen it rewired when someone does enough ERP practice and has had success, that their gut starts to tell them, oh man, I just thought of something and probably that means I need to do it, right? And so the gut response becomes actually lean into that discomfort and uncertainty.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it.
Yeah, one thing you can think about from kind of the physiological aspect of things too is, so when that fight, flight, or freeze response kicks off, a lot of that energy that we're using maybe in digestion isn't important at that point for digestion. It's important to put that energy into the muscles, right? So we can see a shift in what's going on in the body, and that discomfort that we feel as maybe now there's food in our stomach and in our intestines, and we've just interrupted the normal natural process that was going on, because now blood flow is shifting to the extremities to put more blood, which brings more oxygen and therefore even potentially adrenaline into the muscles to get them going. That's the kind of stuff that we need in a fight or flight response when we're running away from somebody, or we have to fight someone, or we have to freeze and stay really quiet and hope nobody notices that we're there or anything like that. So a bit of that shift of energy and that whole bodily experience can be experienced then as this gut reaction, when the reality is there's typically a pretty good physiological reason as to why somebody has that gut reaction, and it definitely has to do with what's going on in the body when we experience the fight, flight, or freeze response. So okay. Well, that was a fun question. Here we go. What's the best way to handle an intrusive thought when it comes in? Should I just let it be and get on with my life, or stop and do an exposure?
I get that question a lot, for sure. I think it's kind of context dependent, right? Because let's say you're in the middle of an important work meeting and you get an intrusive thought, you probably can't call a timeout and say, I need to go sit with my anxiety. I'll be back in like 15 or 20 minutes, right? But what you can do is make a mental note of, ooh, that's something that hit me just now. I maybe need to do some work on that as an exposure later when I have the proper time and energy to give it some focus. But I think, the other thing we can also do is really try to facilitate like an acceptance and a curiosity mindset, and sort of just make space for it mentally to say, okay, this thought just showed up. I don't have to do anything with it. I don't have to respond to it. I have to acknowledge that it's here. Like I may not like the rain, but I do have to admit it's raining outside when it's raining. And I can maybe just be curious about it. Like, I wonder what that's about. Why did that show up? What happens if I ignore it and just let it be in the background? I think a lot of times what I see people do is they get into this fight with the thought of it either has to be present and like right in front of my face and getting all my attention, or it has to be completely gone and removed from my mental headspace. And we just can't control thoughts like that. So if you can come up with this third option of, I'm just going to let it hang out in the background while I pay attention to what's going on in the work meeting, because that's going to serve my values and my purpose better to do that right now. And then maybe later talk about it with my therapist or do an exposure with it.
Yeah. I also get this question a lot, and I would actually love, to hear your take also, Dr. McGrath. But I think that some of it also depends on where they are in treatment, and I think what this person is asking about, let it be and get on with my life. I mean, I think that's really the long-term goal, right? Is that we'll have intrusive thoughts and we'll let them be there and we'll get on with our lives. And in a way that is a form of exposure, because we're not pushing it away or distracting or doing some sort of compulsion. We're doing exactly as you said, April, just letting it be there, accepting that it exists. But, then getting on with whatever we want to do. And I usually answer, similarly to you, as it depends on the situation and the context. But if it's someone, let's say, who, for example, has been through the OCD program and is now in the support phase and is doing fairly well, I would, I might say that they don't have to be doing exposures with every single intrusive thought that comes up, right? They should be doing some sort of exposure as a maintenance basis, however often they feel they need, maybe every couple of days at that point, if they're doing really well. But they might want to make a note of it and do an exposure later, or they might just want to say, okay, there's a thought, here it is, I accept it, I'm just going to let it be there, and I'm just going to do whatever it is that I want to be doing right now, and kind of go up about my day with the thought around. So I think it can really depend, but definitely, if they're in those early phases, to be trying to do as much exposure as they can, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think this question is the evolution of exactly what we want to do in therapy. Initially, we're going to do ERP to things, but the goal of doing ERP is allowing something to be there and getting on with my life, right? So I use the example, I've got tinnitus. So even though neither of you hear it, I hear a very high pitched sound going on right now. And maybe you do have tinnitus too, so maybe you hear one too. But my sound is probably different than your sound. And you can debate all day and tell me, but you're not hearing a sound, because I don't hear the sound, but I do hear the sound. And I just kind of let my life be there and go on with it. I don't sit there and stop and say, now I have to deal with that sound again and figure out how to deal with it, right? So the goal of it is always to be able to sit with something and move on and get on with our lives, and recognize that just because something's there doesn't mean that we have to stop and do things. However, at the beginning, we may be having people purposely stop and do exposure and response prevention, always the key component of all of this, doing that response prevention piece, and allowing ourselves to learn how to get to a point of letting something be and get on with our lives. And that would be a goal too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, very good. Someone said, "Hi there." Hi, good to see you. Can you talk about POCD? Okay, it's the fear that maybe I will do something inappropriate with children. Anybody else want to throw anything else on there?
It's more common than you think.
Yeah.
And I have noticed coming into working with NoCD that the percentage of people who talk to me via NoCD about POCD is much greater than what it was when I saw people in person. I think there's something about the format that makes it feel a little bit okay to talk about, a little bit safe. But yeah, it's a what if that our brain can throw out like many other what ifs. And I think it just has more shock value because it's tapping into something that is so deeply taboo in our culture. Yeah. But thoughts are just thoughts. Thoughts don't have to mean anything. Thoughts don't make us who we are. They don't cause us to act against our will. So it's really not any different than any other piece of OCD content out there, other than just that initial shock value.
I think of a patient of mine who had gone to the local district attorney for the county that he lived in 3 times to ask the district attorney if maybe he would ever get arrested for POCD concerns. And finally, at the 3rd time, the guy didn't even let him in his office. He just said, you really need to leave and go get some help, because I already know what you're going to ask. And there's just no reason to discuss this. Maybe this is an interesting point, and I love to hear both of your take on this. I hear this a lot, which is if it's POCD or if it's scrupulosity, especially of a blasphemous nature, or if it's sexual orientation OCD, those seem to be the 3 that more than anything I hear. Why do I have to have this type of OCD? Why couldn't it be any other kind of OCD but this one? And I'm just wondering, do you both hear that as well too, ever, or what do you think?
Yeah, I hear that, and usually we'll have some kind of talk about like, everybody's worst OCD is their worst, right? Like the contamination people probably really wish they had pedophile OCD. So it's all totally relative. But it's also those are the types of OCD that I see that people just get really, really torn up about. And it maybe just because it is more of a personal nature and because it supposedly says something about who we are.
Supposedly. Well, it tries to. It doesn't mean that anything, but it sure tries to. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I'll give people a little bit of information that, as far as I've been able to observe in my practice for over 10 years, actual pedophiles don't show up to therapy asking for help because of these thoughts that torment them. Like pedophiles enjoy their thoughts. They're not going to show up to therapy and say, please get rid of this for me. Yeah. Right. So that gives us a good sign. Like it's still possible, right? Because we always have to lean into the possibility of something, but probably if you're here complaining about it, it's because you actually care about kids, not because you want to molest them.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think from what I've seen so far, that unfortunately there's a great deal of shame that can come along, with all OCD, but particularly it seems to come with POCD, with, sexual related OCD, probably with certain blasphemy type related OCD, because people feel, like, what kind of person am I to have if I have these thoughts, right? And I think that it's so important to label it like as OCD, like any other OCD, right? This is just your brain, doing what it does and creating this noise that's popping up for you. And we're going to deal with this as if it was the same as contamination OCD, right? Or any other form of OCD where there may not be that same level of shame. Because the thoughts are not you. The thoughts are not what you want to be doing. They're not what you think is important to you. That's just what OCD is latched onto, probably because it gets such a big reaction from you, right? The shame, unfortunately, fuels it. And I often find that depending on how long someone's been struggling with this, they may need to do a little bit of work also just on kind of rebuilding their sense of self, their sense of self-esteem, and however long they've been struggling with what they've been struggling with, and that they've developed this concept of themselves as a potentially bad person, outside of OCD, not OCD about being a bad person, but just shame about thinking that they're bad because of these thoughts, that sometimes there's work that needs to be done there too, after the OCD is getting under control. Although sometimes just treating the OCD can really free them from that, which is also an amazing, beautiful thing to see.
Mm-hmm. But boy, if there's a way to throw some shame in there, OCD is going to find it, and maybe a little salt shaker of guilt as well into the whole experience. We can add that as well too. That would be great. Just to go back to our theme a little bit, wanted to do one more question on that, and this is a purely self-serving question that I'll ask. I remember, and this is going to sound funny when I say it, but when I was a kid, going to a basketball game, and it was in Skokie, Illinois, which is a very Jewish area of Illinois. April worked there, and and I'm trying to remember the name of the center, but it might have been. And this was when I was I was young, like probably 6 years old. So a long time ago. And I think it was the U.S. men's basketball team was playing, and they were kind of traveling across the country playing club teams. And there was a Jewish club basketball team that they were playing against. So we went and we watched this game, and there was a Jewish family there. Of course, there were lots of, and I had never seen someone with a yamaka before. So I asked the boy about, why are you wearing that, and what does that mean? And something sticks in my head from back then about he said, and this gets to my point. You can't take more than 3 steps without it on, or something. Now maybe I made that whole thing up or something, but Rosie, living in the community, I know that sometimes females wear wigs in Orthodox communities, males wear head coverings. We see hats, various things. So what is, just for an understanding for all of us, because this is where I get some cultural education, what do the various head coverings kind of mean or represent in the Jewish? Thank you for the amazingly long-winded intro to that question. But
it's a great story. It's a great story, and people, a lot of times, Orthodox Jews who are used to being in areas where there's a lot of non-Orthodox or non-Jewish people are often used to these types of questions. So hopefully that boy was happy to get a chance to answer you. But you didn't, you didn't make it up. There is a concept of not walking a certain distance, which, it's really like 4 steps without, the yarmulke on for a boy or a man. Yeah. So you didn't make that up. But so there are different things. So for, boys from age 3 and up, they wear, a yarmulke or some sort of head covering. And this is, it's actually not strictly the letter of the law, but it's kind of a universally adopted custom that, it has the status really of law because it's so universally adopted. And the idea behind that is to constantly remind yourself that there's someone above you, right? That there's God out there, and you're not kind of the top of the world, to not become arrogant, so to speak. So it's kind of like a level of modesty and humbleness, and just to remember kind of, your path in life, your goal, that you're kind of, being guided and part of a bigger picture. All the other hats and various things that you see men wearing are all cultural,
Okay.
so every culture has, and none of them are law. None,
Okay.
not one of them,
Got
at least from my understanding, right? So
Mhm.
each culture has their own hats that they wear, and sometimes they have different hats that they wear for celebrations or for holidays, or they'll do their hats a different way. Some people wear their hats with the brim up, with the brim down. They wear the furry hat, they wear the small hat, they have a weekday hat, they have a Shabbos hat. Hats that there's all sorts of hats out there, and they're all cultural. But
Okay.
for women, Orthodox women who are married, in general, cover their hair, and so that might be with a wig or with a scarf. I apologize for the call in the background. I don't know how to turn that off. So that's something that applies to women who are married, but not to girls or women who are not married.
Okay.
So
And
that answers your question.
is there a law on the head covering piece for women then, of covering your hair, or is that more of a
So
cultural? Okay.
that's widely considered to be law, and then there are certain different interpretations about exactly how much needs to be covered and what proportion, and if a certain amount that could be showing or not showing. Some women don't cover in their own homes or in front of their certain relatives, or so it's kind of like a more of a level of modesty, like covering the body, where sometimes, like women could uncover their hair in front of their female friends or, other family members, although most people generally don't, but they may on occasion.
Okay.
Yeah, is the idea generally that it's only the husband that is supposed to see the real hair once you're married?
Sort of. Yeah. I mean, that's part of it, is to keep the hair, set aside for the husband. Although, of course, like I said, other women could see your hair, your children, your father, for example, right? Certain close male relatives. Usually most people agree with that. Some people may be more strict. But I'm getting a comment from Hadassah. She understands
I
this.
saw Hadassah too. Yeah. I like that.
Translate. Yeah. So sometimes I do have to mentally translate my head. So thank you, Hadassah, for that. Actually, if I can, I just want to, I read something earlier that Hadassah posted about POCD with babysitting culture is really hard, right? And I just want to, go back to that and validate that, Hadassah, I don't know, who you are and your age, but in the Jewish culture, in most Jewish communities, high school age girls are very much, into babysitting, running camps, working with children, almost like it's expected as a standard part of just being a teenage Jewish girl that you should be good with kids, and of course not all girls probably enjoy being with kids, and that's a separate thing. But if you're struggling with
April killed him.
if you're struggling with POCD, that could be extremely challenging, and I would say that this is something that, you really should be like prioritized, to be worked on as much as possible if this is something that you want to be doing, because it could be very hard to be a high school teenage girl and see all your friends babysitting and running camps and even there, in the Jewish culture, there's large families. You might go over to a friend's house and they have younger siblings more times than not. That's going to be the case. So this is something that can really come up in so many ways of daily life. It's not just something that, oh, sure, it would be nice to spend time with kids, but it's not really getting in the way of my life. This is a major thing in the community. And so it's definitely something to really prioritize and work on. And it can be so, I think, rewarding and freeing to be able to get through that and actually be able to do what you want to do.
Because isn't the concept of a sleepaway camp big in Jewish culture as well?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Really big. Yeah. Yeah. So that can definitely have, all of this can come up and have an impact for sure. Yeah. I actually, if I could bring up something else really quick,
of course, we've got
you mentioned
6 minutes left. Yeah.
You mentioned your client going to the DA, right, and asking for reassurance, and since we're doing the topic of Judaism, it made me think about, clients often have a tendency to run to their rabbis, right, and ask, is this okay? Is that okay? I dropped this into my chicken soup pot. Is that okay? Right. And a certain degree of that is normal. Right. And that we're encouraged to ask a rabbi if we're not sure. Right. But then we have to be careful. What does it mean to be not sure? Right. We have to sort of differentiate between a real question, right, that would be common and normal to bring to a rabbi, and a question that came from a doubt. right? And then we have to actually, as much as possible, educate the rabbis, right? And there are a number of rabbis who are very well trained in this area and know specifically how to answer questions from people with OCD, and that they know where the questions are coming from, and they know how to answer them, taking into account the context. And sometimes they'll actually be guided towards kind of not giving an answer, kind of saying, maybe it's possible, that might be the case, to actually just stop giving that constant reassurance, to the person. So that's an important piece to think about if you're working with a client in this community, and they're going to ask their rabbi things. And you might actually encourage, go ask your rabbi if this is okay. But we have to think about how that works in the context, and ideally, as much as possible, work alongside with the rabbi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Last question I want to bring up. I like Brian's question here, and this I think gets to the cultural piece too. Rosie, I've always joked growing up. I grew up Irish Catholic, and there's I think a share between Irish Catholic mothers and Jewish mothers of worry, worry, shame, shame, worry, shame, worry, and so I see that sometimes that there's a cultural aspect that worry is a part of a culture, right? And then when does worry come in as anxiety and OCD as well too? So I'm interested from both of you. How do you both talk to people about the shame that OCD may bring about for them? And how do you get people to become indifferent even to whatever it is that pops in their head, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of it comes back to core values, as you talk about mothers, and I would think that really this applies to all mothers, right? That mothers worry about their children, and that's because their children are so important to them, right? And to really recognize and validate that core value, like this is bothering you so much because you care so much about your children, right? But then to think about, so therefore, how do you want to live your life, right? Because you care so much about your children, do you want to live your life, eliminating all risk and closing off your life in such a way that you don't let your children play outside, for example, or, you check and recheck everything that they eat and everything that they do and everywhere that they go. And then maybe you're keeping them physically safe, right? But what kind of emotional life are you giving them? And so I think to help people refocus on their own values that are at the core of this, that are driving the worry, right? The worry is coming from a real value, that I think can help a lot to put this in perspective, whether it's, shame, it's shame or it's religious related OCD or it's any sort of OCD. That's
awesome. Yeah. April, you want to throw anything on that?
Sure. I guess I go back to definitions with questions like this. And what does it mean what is shame? What is guilt? How are those different, right? And guilt is I did something bad and I'm sorry for it. And shame is this more pervasive, just I am bad. Like I'm wrong. Something is bad about me. And I think a lot of that is just misplaced, right? Like you can't really see the sign behind me, but one of the things it says is feelings are not facts. So just because you feel like you're bad or wrong does not mean that you are. I don't think people inherently are good or bad. We're just people and we make different decisions throughout our lives and those decisions have consequences. And if I truly believe that we're allowed to think whatever we want and thoughts are just thoughts, then there's no reason that whatever thoughts you have, OCD or otherwise, should make you feel ashamed, right? The things that are happening in OCD and anxiety are kind of natural brain processes that have just run amok. So you're just being human. And even though it feels like shame, it's feelings are not facts. I know that's not a great concrete answer that people like, but sometimes we have to get kind of abstract with this stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's always fascinating to have these conversations, to look at the way culture and religion and backgrounds and ethnicity and any other way we define it play a role, not only in our lives in general, but in the presentation and the way OCD may affect us as well, too. So I want to thank both of you for being here tonight. This was a wonderful conversation. Really, really enjoyed our time together. And we'll be back again next week with kind of an open forum. So Ashley R. asked, how do we ask more questions about scrupulosity? Come back next week, Ashley. We'll talk some more about those types of things. But But Rosie and April, thank you so very much for being here tonight. And I know that everybody's really benefited from this discussion and learned something as well too, which is always what I want to do as we do these Diversity Matters webinars, to help people in all communities understand people from other communities, and all of us develop a little bit better tolerance of each other as well. So thank you, and good night, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.